Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. The information presented in this video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended as specific educational, financial, or legal advice. The landscape of education is complex and varies significantly by state and district. We encourage you to conduct your own research and consult with local educational professionals when making decisions for your family. You're standing in front of your child's school, or maybe the school they're zoned for. You look at the building and a knot forms in your stomach. You've read the online reviews, you've seen the test scores, you've heard the stories from other parents in the neighborhood. Maybe it's great, but maybe it's not. Maybe the class sizes are ballooning, the best teachers are leaving, and the curriculum feels like it was designed a century ago. You want more for your kid. You want better. You feel trapped, and then you hear about something else, a different option. It's called a charter school. It's tuition-free just like a public school. The pictures on its website show smiling kids in crisp uniforms, working on brand new laptops in bright, clean classrooms. Promises a special focus maybe on science or the arts or college prep. Sounds perfect. Almost too perfect. And the questions start flooding your mind. What even is this place? Is it a private school in disguise? Is it truly public? Where does the money come from? And the biggest question of all, is it actually better? Or is this just clever marketing for something that could be much, much worse? If you have ever asked yourself these questions, you are not alone. And over the next 10 parts, we are going to answer every single one of them. This series is your definitive guide to the most disruptive and controversial force in American education today. We will cut through the political talking points, the union rhetoric, and the glossy marketing brochures to give you the unvarnished truth. By the time we're done, you will understand exactly what charter schools are, where they came from, how they're funded, who they serve, and the explosive debate over whether they are the saviors of American education or a Trojan horse designed to destroy it. Because this isn't just a niche topic for policy wonks anymore. Right now, as you watch this, over 3.7 million American children are attending nearly 8,000 charter schools across the country. That's more students than the entire public school populations of Los Angeles and Chicago combined. 30 years ago, that number was 0. This is a revolution that has happened in plain sight, a multi-billion-dollar industry that has grown from a single radical idea into a political juggernaut that influences presidents, governors, and mayors. It's an ideological battleground, pitting neighbor against neighbor and teacher against teacher. To their supporters, charter schools are the last, best hope for children trapped in failing schools. They are laboratories of innovation, free from the crushing bureaucracy and rigid union contracts that stifle traditional public schools. They offer choice to parents, especially low-income and minority families who for generations have had none. They are nimble, accountable, and driven by a relentless focus on results. In this version of the story, charters are David, fighting the Goliath of an entrenched monopolistic system that has failed our children for far too long. But to their critics, charter schools are a disaster, a dangerous experiment in privatization that drains billions of dollars from already underfunded public schools, leaving the most vulnerable students behind. They argue that charters cherry-pick the best students, expel the difficult ones, and are often run by for-profit corporations with no public oversight. They see a landscape of financial scandals, questionable academic results, and a coordinated attack on the very idea of public education as a cornerstone of American democracy. In this version, charters are the wolf in sheep's clothing, promising opportunity while actively dismantling one of our nation's most important institutions. So which story is true, the hero or the villain? The reality, as we're about to discover, is far more complicated and far more fascinating than either side wants you to believe. And to understand how we got here, we have to go back to a time before the first charter school ever opened its doors. We have to understand the problem they were created to solve. Picture the American public school system in the 1970s and 80s. For most of the 20th century, it was the envy of the world. But by the latter half, cracks were beginning to show. A growing chorus of parents, politicians, and even educators felt the system had become a vast, unshakable bureaucracy. A one-size-fits-all model designed for an industrial economy that was struggling to adapt to a new technological world. School districts were often massive, with layers upon layers of administrators making decisions far removed from the actual classroom. Teachers felt like cogs in a machine, bound by district mandates and union rules that dictated everything from what page of the textbook they should be on to how their classroom should be arranged. There was a sense of stagnation, a feeling that the system was too big to fail but also too big to change. Then in 1983, a landmark report from the federal government landed like a bombshell. It was called A Nation at Risk, and its language was apocalyptic. It declared that a rising tide of mediocrity was threatening our very future as a nation. It compared our lackluster academic performance to an act of unilateral educational disarmament. The report ignited a firestorm of public debate and created a desperate hunger for new ideas, for any ideas that could fix our schools. The idea for what would become charter schools didn't come from a billionaire philanthropist or a conservative think tank. It came from inside the system itself. The first whispers came from a New England professor named Ray Budde in the 1970s, but the idea was truly given a national platform by an unlikely source. Albert Shanker, the powerful and charismatic president of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the largest teachers' unions in the country. That's right. The man who would become one of the charter movement's biggest icons was, for a time, the head of a teachers' union. In 1988, Shanker gave a speech that would change everything. He envisioned a new kind of public school, one that would be run not by the central district office, but by the teachers themselves. He called them charter schools, borrowing a term from the old world, where explorers would be given a charter by a king or queen to venture into new territories. Shanker's vision was for groups of teachers to be given a charter, or a contract, to create their own schools. They would be freed from most of the rules and regulations of the district. In exchange for this freedom, this autonomy, they would be held to a higher standard of accountability. If they produced great results, their charter would be renewed. If they failed, they would be shut down. It was a simple, powerful bargain. Autonomy for accountability. Shanker saw it as a way to empower teachers, to unleash their creativity and professionalism, and to create a space for real innovation within the public school system itself. This was not a private school voucher plan. It was not about privatization. It was an idea born from a desire to make public schools better, championed by the leader of a teachers' union. That idea, radical and untested, found fertile ground in an unlikely place: Minnesota. In 1991, a bipartisan group of lawmakers, frustrated with the pace of reform, passed the nation's first charter school law. It was a modest bill, creating a small pilot program. The goal was to create a few laboratory schools to test new teaching methods that could then be shared with the entire public system. No one involved in that first bill could have possibly imagined what they were about to unleash. They thought they were planting a small garden. They ended up planting a forest that would grow in ways they never intended, spreading across the entire country. That simple bargain of autonomy for accountability would be stretched, twisted, and reinterpreted by politicians, entrepreneurs, and activists. It would create educational empires and spawn bitter political wars. It would provide a lifeline for some families and a false promise for others. That first law in Minnesota didn't just create a new type of school. It opened a Pandora's box in American education, and for the last 30 years, we have all been living with the consequences. And the first thing to fly out of that box wasn't a single idea but two powerful, competing visions for the future of America's children, championed by two groups who agreed on almost nothing else. To understand the explosion of charter schools in the 1990s and 2000s, you have to understand this bizarre shotgun wedding of political opposites. It was an alliance between progressives and conservatives, teachers' unions and free market think tanks. And for a brief, strange moment in American history, they all wanted the same thing, or so they thought. On one side, you had the dreamers, the educational innovators. These were often progressive educators, community activists, and even leaders within teachers' unions. People like Albert Shanker, the formidable president of the American Federation of Teachers. In the late 1980s, Shanker saw the potential for a new kind of public school. He envisioned schools that would be laboratories of innovation, run by teachers themselves, free from the crushing weight of district bureaucracy. Imagine a school designed from the ground up by its own educators to serve the specific needs of its students. A school focused on art or science or dual language immersion. These wouldn't be schools competing with the public system. They would be beacons of excellence within the public system, developing new teaching methods that could then be shared with every other school in the district. For this group, charter was synonymous with empowerment. It was about giving power to teachers and communities, not taking it away. It was a bottom-up revolution. But on the other side of this alliance, you had the market makers, the disciples of Milton Friedman. These were conservatives and libertarians who had been arguing for decades that the public school system was a failed government monopoly. They believed the only way to fix education was to inject the harsh, unforgiving, but ultimately effective discipline of the free market. Their solution was school choice. Let parents choose where to send their kids, and let the funding, the tax dollars, follow the child. In this model, schools would be forced to compete for students, who were now customers. Good schools would thrive. Bad schools would go out of business. For this group, charter was a Trojan horse for competition and privatization. It was a top-down disruption. So you have two fundamentally different philosophies, staring at the same word charter, and seeing two completely different futures. One saw small, collaborative teacher-led labs. The other saw a dynamic marketplace of competing educational brands. And for a while, this profound disagreement didn't matter, because both sides were united by a common enemy: the status quo. Both believed the traditional public school system, with its massive bureaucracies, rigid rules, and one-size-fits-all approach, was failing America's kids. And the American public was primed to believe it. This wasn't just a niche debate among policy wonks. A sense of crisis was gripping the nation, and that crisis had a name: a nation at risk. In 1983, a landmark report commissioned by the Reagan administration landed like a bombshell. Its language wasn't academic or cautious, it was apocalyptic. It declared, "The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people." It warned of a world where the U.S. was being overtaken economically and technologically by its global competitors. The report used military metaphors, stating, "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war." Suddenly, school board meetings and PTA bake sales weren't just local issues. They were matters of national security. The report electrified the country. It created a pervasive anxiety that American schools were broken, that kids weren't learning, and that the American dream was slipping away. Whether the report's claims were entirely accurate or wildly exaggerated is a debate for another time. What mattered was its impact. It created immense political pressure to do something. Anything. The old way wasn't working. The public was desperate for a new solution. And into this climate of fear and frustration stepped the charter school idea. It was the perfect product for the moment. To the left, it offered innovation, teacher empowerment, and a way to help underserved students trapped in failing schools. To the right, it offered choice, competition, and a way to break the government monopoly. It was a political Swiss Army knife. You could present it as a progressive reform or a conservative revolution, and you'd be right both times. This dual identity is what allowed the idea to spread like wildfire. After Minnesota passed its law in 1991, California followed in 1992. Then came Colorado, Georgia, Massachusetts, Michigan, Wisconsin. By the end of the decade, the majority of states had charter school laws on the books. The federal government got on board too. President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, became a vocal champion, providing federal grants to help new charter schools get started. He saw them through the progressive lens as tools for public school innovation. His successor, President George W. Bush, a Republican, pushed them even harder through his No Child Left Behind Act, but he saw them through the conservative lens as engines of competition and accountability. The movement was a runaway train, but as it gained speed, a subtle and critical shift began to happen. The original vision, Al Shanker's vision of small, teacher-run laboratories, started to get lost in the noise. It was a lovely, idealistic concept, but it was difficult to scale up. Starting a school from scratch is incredibly hard. It requires a building, a curriculum, a budget, navigating a mountain of paperwork. It's more than most teachers, even the most dedicated, could handle on their own. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. The market makers saw this vacuum and rushed to fill it. They realized that if you wanted to create hundreds, even thousands, of new schools quickly to compete with the traditional system, you couldn't rely on grassroots efforts alone. You needed organization. You needed capital. You needed efficiency. You needed a model that could be replicated easily like a fast food franchise. This gave rise to a new player in the education world: the Charter Management Organization, or CMO. These organizations, some nonprofit and some, controversially, for profit, acted as a central nervous system for networks of charter schools. They could handle the logistics, the fundraising, the real estate, and the political battles, freeing up principals and teachers to focus on the classroom. They brought a level of scale and professionalism that the early independent mom-and-pop charters simply couldn't match. Networks like KIPP, or Knowledge is Power program, began to expand rapidly, building a national reputation for their no excuses model, which promised to get dramatic results for low-income students through high expectations, longer school days, and strict discipline. They were celebrated as miracle workers, proof that poverty was not destiny. Their success stories became the public face of the charter movement. But this new, more corporate model fundamentally changed the DNA of the charter school idea. The focus shifted from teacher-led innovation to standardized, replicable systems. The goal was no longer just to create a few unique laboratory schools. It was to build an entire alternative school system that could operate at scale. The battle for the soul of the charter movement was tipping. The bottom-up dreamers were still there, but the top-down disruptors were gaining ground. Armed with venture capital, philanthropic donations, and a powerful data-driven narrative of success. And with this shift came a question that would come to define the entire charter school debate for the next 20 years. If a school is publicly funded but privately managed, is it still a public school? And if these new charter networks were nonprofits, where was all this new money coming from? And more importantly, where was it going? The line between public service and private enterprise was beginning to blur, creating a multi-billion-dollar industry where the line between educating children and generating revenue would become dangerously unclear. That blurring line wasn't an accident. It was a design. And to understand it, you have to understand the two new powerful entities that emerged from the primordial soup of education reform, the CMO and the EMO. Charter management organizations and education management organizations. They sound like boring corporate acronyms, and that's partly the point. They mask a revolutionary and deeply controversial idea. Let's start with the CMOs, the nonprofits. The story here, at least on the surface, is one of mission and scale. Imagine a group of passionate educators who start one incredibly successful charter school. The test scores are great, parents are lining up. There's a waiting list a mile long. They think, what if we could replicate this success? What if we could open a second school, then a third, then a network of schools all following our proven model? That's a CMO. They're nonprofit, meaning any surplus revenue, any profit, doesn't go to shareholders or owners. It gets reinvested back into the schools to expand the network to serve more kids. Think of organizations like KIPP or Achievement First. Their goal, they would argue, isn't profit, it's impact. They are a public charity, a mission-driven enterprise scaling up a solution. But then there's the other model, EMO, the for-profit education management organization. And this is where the picture gets infinitely more complicated. The EMO operates on a fundamentally different premise. The goal isn't just impact, it's return on investment. The EMO answers not just to a board of trustees, but to investors, to shareholders who expect to make money. Suddenly, the language of education starts to sound a lot more like the language of Wall Street. We're talking about market share, operational efficiencies, revenue streams, and quarterly earnings. The student is no longer just a student, they are, in a very real sense, a source of revenue. And in the late 1990s, no one embodied this new frontier more than a man named Chris Whittle and his audacious venture, Edison Schools. Whittle wasn't an educator. He was a media mogul, a brilliant marketer who saw a massive, untapped market worth billions of dollars, public education. He saw an industry full of what he considered outdated, inefficient monopolies, traditional school districts, and he believed he could do it better. The promise of Edison was intoxicating. It was the Silicon Valley pitch applied to the Little Red Schoolhouse. They would bring in a standardized, research-based curriculum. They would leverage technology in the classroom. They would extend the school day and the school year. They would manage the budget, the hiring, the entire operation with corporate efficiency. And by doing all this, they could take the same public dollars a traditional school gets for each student, provide a superior education, and still have enough left over to turn a handsome profit for their investors. Sounded like a win-win-win. Kids get a better education, parents get a better choice, and investors make money. The free market, they claimed, was finally coming to save public education. Wall Street bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. Edison Schools went public in 1999, raising over $100 million. Financial analysts breathlessly predicted it would become the General Motors of education. You could now buy stock in the future of American schooling. This was the moment the line didn't just blur. It was erased and redrawn in ticker tape. But a fundamental question haunted the entire enterprise. Where does the profit come from? Public schools are not exactly known for having massive cash surpluses lying around. They struggle to buy new textbooks, to fix leaky roofs, to pay teachers a competitive wage. So if you're an EMO, and you're receiving the exact same amount of public money per student, how do you squeeze a profit out of it? The answer is efficiency. But what does efficiency mean in a school? In a factory, it means streamlining an assembly line, reducing waste, maybe automating a few jobs. In a school, the product is a child's education, and the raw materials are teachers, books, counselors, and nurses. So, creating efficiency often meant cutting costs. It meant larger class sizes. It meant hiring younger, less experienced, and therefore cheaper teachers. It meant trimming frills like art, music, or library staff. It meant standardizing everything, creating a one-size-fits-all model that could be easily replicated, whether the school was in Miami or Milwaukee. And it led to another, more troubling accusation, that some for-profit charters were finding efficiencies by carefully managing their enrollment. The charge was that they were skimming the cream, that they were subtly, or not so subtly, counseling out students who were more expensive to educate. Students with severe disabilities, students with behavioral problems, students who were still learning English. A public school has to take every child who walks through its doors. A charter school, with its own application and enrollment process, has more control. By enrolling fewer high-need students, costs go down, test scores go up, and the school looks like a miracle. The profit margin widens. This business model, the for-profit EMO, ran into a huge roadblock, however. The laws in most states explicitly said that a public charter school had to be a non-profit entity. Public money, the thinking went, should not be used to generate private profit for shareholders. It seemed like a dead end for the EMO dream. But business is very, very good at finding loopholes. And the loophole they found was a work of corporate genius. It created a structure that is now at the heart of the charter school debate. And it is so cleverly designed that most parents have no idea it even exists. Here's how it works. A group of local community members forms a nonprofit board to apply for a charter. On paper, this school is a 501c3 nonprofit, just like the law requires. But then, this new nonprofit board signs a sweeping, ironclad contract with a for-profit education management organization. This contract essentially outsources the entire operation of the school to the for-profit company. The EMO handles everything. It hires the teachers and the principal, it provides the curriculum, it manages the finances, it even leases the school building and the classroom furniture, often from another subsidiary company it owns. In exchange for these services, the nonprofit school board agrees to pay the for-profit EMO a management fee. And that fee is typically almost all of it. 1995, sometimes even 97% of the public taxpayer dollars that flow to the nonprofit school are immediately transferred, or swept, into the bank account of the private for-profit corporation. Think about that. The school is a nonprofit in name only. It's a shell, a pass-through. It exists as a legal fiction to allow a for-profit company to run a public school with public money. The nonprofit board has little to no real power. The crucial decisions about staffing, budget, and curriculum are all being made by a corporate office, often hundreds of miles away, an office that has a legal fiduciary duty to maximize profits for its shareholders. This structure changed everything. It created a backdoor for private enterprise to enter the public education market on a massive scale. It allowed for-profit companies to wrap themselves in the trusted, community-friendly language of nonprofit public schooling, while operating with the motives and methods of a private corporation. And once this model was perfected, the floodgates opened. It was no longer just about a few idealistic educators trying to start a better school. It was about national and even international corporations seeing a new, stable, government-funded industry to invest in. Real estate developers got into the game, creating companies that would build schools, and then lease them back to the charter management companies they also owned, charging exorbitant rents paid for by taxpayers. Private equity firms, hedge funds, they all started to see the potential for steady, recession-proof returns, backed by the full faith and credit of the American taxpayer. The battle for the soul of public education was on, and it wasn't just being fought in school board meetings anymore. It was being fought on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The question was no longer could you run a school like a business. The question was becoming, what happens when the business becomes more important than the school? The answer wasn't simple because for the first time, a school wasn't just a building or a community hub. It was an asset. It was a line item on a quarterly earnings report. And the company that perfectly embodied this new reality was called K-12 Inc. In 2007, K-12 Inc. went public. Imagine that. A company whose primary product was the education of children, listed right alongside giants like Ford and Microsoft, its stock ticker LRN, flashing across the screens of Wall Street traders. The initial public offering, the IPO, raised over $100 million. It was a declaration. Education wasn't just a market, it was a hot market. The promise K-12 sold was intoxicatingly modern. It was the promise of a school delivered to your doorstep, a personalized education beamed directly into your home through the magic of the internet. They targeted parents who felt left behind by the traditional system, parents in rural areas with underfunded schools, parents of children with special needs or who were being bullied, parents who simply believed their local school wasn't good enough. K-12 offered them an escape hatch. They called their schools virtual academies. The pitch was compelling. Your child gets a top-tier individualized curriculum, designed by experts. They can learn at their own pace, free from the distractions and dangers of a crowded classroom. A state-certified teacher is just an email or a phone call away. And the best part? It's a public school. It's free. To a worried parent, this sounded like a revolution. Sounded like the future. And for a while the story was all about growth. K-12 and other for-profit online charter operators, like Connections Academy, expanded at a breathtaking pace. State after state passed laws enabling the creation of these virtual schools. Enrollment numbers exploded. Their stock prices soared. Investors were ecstatic. Here was a business model that seemed almost perfect. The model worked by leveraging public funds with corporate efficiency. Here's how. A company like K-12 would partner with a small, often struggling school district in a state. That district would authorize the company to operate a statewide online charter school. Because it was a public charter school, it received per-pupil funding from the state, thousands of dollars for every student who enrolled. That money, taxpayer money, flowed directly from the state treasury to the for-profit corporation. And the corporation was a master of cutting costs. There was no expensive school building to maintain, no gymnasium, no cafeteria, no bus fleet. The biggest expense in any traditional school is personnel. Teachers, aides, counselors. But in a virtual charter, a single teacher could be assigned to oversee dozens, sometimes hundreds of students. The curriculum was standardized, packaged, and shipped out in boxes. The teaching was often done by a parent, rebranded as a learning coach, following a script on a computer screen. This was the genius of the business model. Privatized the profits but socialized the costs. The state paid for each student, but the corporation captured the savings from its high-tech, low-overhead delivery system. It was a recipe for immense profitability, and for years the focus remained on the stock price, the expansion into new states, the ever-growing enrollment figures. It was a story of success, a story of innovation disrupting a stale, old-fashioned public institution. But then another story began to emerge. It didn't come from Wall Street analysts but from investigative journalists, academic researchers, and eventually from disillusioned parents and teachers. They started asking a very simple question. Are the kids actually learning? The first reports were scattered, then they became a flood. Studies from respected institutions like Stanford University and the National Education Policy Center began painting a grim picture. They found that, on average, students at full-time virtual charters were learning significantly less than their peers in traditional public schools. A landmark 2015 Stanford study found that the academic growth of students in online charters was so poor, it was as if they hadn't attended school at all for the year in reading and had gone backward in math. The numbers were staggering. Graduation rates at many of these virtual academies were below 50%. In some states, they were in the 30s. Student churn was massive. Thousands of students would enroll in the fall only to leave by the spring, a revolving door that made consistent learning almost impossible. Whistleblowers, former teachers and enrollment counselors, came forward with disturbing allegations. They spoke of intense pressure from corporate headquarters to enroll and retain students, regardless of whether the online model was a good fit for them. They described unmanageable caseloads, with teachers responsible for so many students they could offer little more than cursory, automated feedback. Parents who had once been true believers started to share their own stories. Stories of children staring blankly at screens for hours a day, isolated from their peers. Stories of technical glitches, unresponsive teachers, and a curriculum that felt more like a rigid checklist than a real education. The promise of a personalized futuristic school began to look more like a correspondence course from the 1950s, just with a login and a password. The free public school came with a hidden cost: the academic and social development of their children. Of course, the for-profit companies had their defense. They argued they were serving a more challenging student population. students who were already struggling academically or who had dropped out of traditional schools. They claimed that standardized tests were an unfair way to measure their success. They pointed to their own internal satisfaction surveys, which often showed high marks from parents, and they would always highlight individual success stories, the brilliant student who thrived outside the confines of a brick-and-mortar school. There's truth in that. For a small subset of students, child actors, elite athletes, or deeply self-motivated learners, the flexibility of an online school can be a godsend. But the data suggested this was the exception, not the rule. The problem was that the model was being sold as a mass solution, a replacement for public education, funded with billions of public dollars. And the incentives were all wrong. The system wasn't designed to maximize learning. It was designed to maximize enrollment. Every student was a revenue stream. The more students you could sign up, the more money you made for your shareholders. This fundamental conflict of interest sat at the heart of the for-profit charter movement. When a decision had to be made between investing more in student support, like hiring more teachers to lower class sizes, or hitting a quarterly earnings target, the pressure from Wall Street was immense. The fiduciary duty of a publicly traded company is to its shareholders, not to its students. This was the new battleground. It revealed a deep philosophical divide in the charter school movement. Was the goal to create innovative new schools, or was it to create profitable new businesses? The rise of the for-profit virtual charters showed just how blurry that line could become. But even as the controversy around online schools was heating up, a different, even more influential charter school model was taking over America's cities. It was a model born not in a corporate boardroom, but in the classrooms of Houston and New York. It wasn't about technology or virtual learning. It was about discipline, data, and sheer force of will. It was called No Excuses, and its charismatic leaders were about to become the new superstars of education reform, promising to do what everyone else thought was impossible: close the achievement gap. Their methods would be celebrated and condemned, and they would push the charter school experiment into its most ambitious and controversial phase yet. This new breed of charter school operated on a simple, powerful, and deeply controversial premise. There are no excuses for failure. Not poverty, not a difficult home life, not the neighborhood you grew up in. The school, and the school alone, could be the lever to change a child's destiny. If students weren't learning, it wasn't their fault, and it wasn't society's fault. It was the school's fault. This was the no excuses philosophy, and it would detonate like a bomb in the world of American education. At the heart of this explosion was the Knowledge is Power program, better known as KIPP. Its story began with two young, idealistic teachers from the Teach for America program, Dave Levin and Mike Feinberg, sent to a struggling middle school in Houston, Texas. In the early 1990s, they were confronted with the stark reality of the achievement gap. They saw brilliant, capable kids who were years behind academically. They believed the traditional system was failing them, bound by low expectations and bureaucratic inertia. So, they decided to create their own program, a school within a school, built on a set of radical ideas. Their founding principle was revolutionary in its simplicity: more time. If their students were behind, they needed more time to catch up. So the KIPP school day started earlier and ended later, running from 7:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. They had mandatory classes every other Saturday. They even had a required 3-week summer school session. The traditional 180-day school year was thrown out the window. KIPP students would spend 50 to 60% more time in class than their peers in traditional public schools. It was a brute force approach, a relentless academic boot camp designed to close the gap one extra hour at a time. But time was only one ingredient. The second was a culture of sky-high expectations. From the moment a fifth grader walked through the door, the message was hammered home: you are going to college. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement of fact. This mantra, climbing the mountain to college, was plastered on walls, chanted in assemblies, and woven into the fabric of every lesson. For children from communities where college was a distant dream for a select few, this was a profound psychological shift. The school was explicitly telling them that their future was not limited by their present circumstances. To reinforce this, classrooms were named after universities like Harvard, Yale, and Spelman. Teachers were called instructors on the mountain climb. Every detail was engineered to build a powerful, shared identity centered on academic achievement and future success. To protect this high-octane learning environment, No Excuses schools implemented a third, and perhaps most famous pillar: strict, uncompromising discipline. The philosophy was that not a single second of instructional time could be wasted. This meant creating a world of absolute order. Hallways were often silent, with students walking in single-file lines on designated tape marks. Demerits were given for the smallest infractions: an untucked shirt, a slouch in a chair, eyes wandering from the speaker. Many schools used acronyms to codify behavior, the most famous being SLANT. Sit up, listen, ask and answer questions, nod your head, and track the speaker with your eyes. This wasn't just about control, it was about culture. Proponents called it sweating the small stuff, so that teachers could focus entirely on teaching, and students could focus entirely on learning. In a chaotic world, the school would be an oasis of predictability and focus. Every minute was scripted, every transition choreographed. The goal was to remove every possible distraction, creating a frictionless environment for academic instruction. The school's signature motto, "Work hard, be nice," became the simple, non-negotiable law of the land. This relentless focus on instruction was powered by a fourth pillar: a fanatical devotion to data. No excuses schools were data-driven before that was a popular buzzword. Students were tested constantly, with short quizzes and assessments nearly every day. The data from these tests was analyzed immediately. If a group of students struggled with a specific concept on Tuesday, the teacher would reteach that exact concept on Wednesday. Instruction wasn't based on a teacher's intuition or a preset curriculum calendar. It was a dynamic response to a constant stream of performance data. This created a hyper-efficient feedback loop, identifying and fixing academic weaknesses in near real time. Finally, none of this worked without the fifth and final pillar: total teacher commitment. Teaching at a no-excuses school wasn't a job, it was a mission. Teachers worked grueling hours, arriving before dawn and leaving long after sunset. They were expected to be available by cell phone in the evenings to help students with homework. They graded papers, analyzed data, and planned lessons with a level of intensity that was unheard of in most schools. In return, they were given significant autonomy in their classrooms and were part of a team that shared a fervent belief that they were, quite literally, saving lives. And then came the results. The test scores from the first KIPP academies and other no-excuses schools like Achievement First and Uncommon schools were simply staggering. They were taking student populations that were almost entirely low-income and minority, students who had been written off by the system, and catapulting them to the highest levels of academic achievement. In city after city, these charter schools weren't just closing the achievement gap, they were reversing it. Their students weren't just catching up to their more affluent suburban peers. In many cases, they were outperforming them, especially in mathematics. These numbers were like rocket fuel for the charter school movement. The media dubbed them miracle schools. A powerful, compelling narrative took hold. Poverty was not destiny. We had found the cure for failing schools. The secret recipe had been discovered, and it could be bottled, scaled, and replicated across the country. This narrative attracted a tidal wave of funding. Billionaire philanthropists from the worlds of tech and finance, the Gates Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, Eli Broad, poured hundreds of millions of dollars into these networks. They saw what they recognized: a scalable model with a proven track record of quantifiable results. KIPP and its brethren became the undisputed superstars of education reform. They were the proof of concept that charter schools could deliver on their original promise in the most dramatic way imaginable. They built a brand, a methodology, and a track record that was impossible to ignore. For a nation desperate for answers to the crisis in urban education, the no-excuses model seemed like a prayer answered. But even as these schools were being celebrated on magazine covers and praised by presidents, troubling questions began to surface. The very methods that produced these extraordinary results, the long hours, the rigid discipline, the intense focus on test prep, started to draw scrutiny. Critics began to ask about the students who didn't make it, the ones who were counseled out or left because they couldn't handle the demanding culture. They questioned the psychological cost of such a regimented environment on young children. The same system that supporters called high expectation was beginning to be described by detractors with a very different word: punitive. The miracle, it seemed, might have a dark side. This dark side had a name: no excuses. It was a philosophy, a pedagogy, and a brand of school culture all rolled into one. The core idea was simple and on the surface incredibly compelling. It held that poverty was not an excuse for academic failure. A chaotic home life was not an excuse. A dangerous neighborhood was not an excuse. For students to succeed, the school had to become a hermetically sealed environment of order, safety, and relentless academic focus. Every single minute of the day was to be structured. Every behavior was to be managed. Every expectation was to be made crystal clear. The logic was powerful. If you could eliminate all the variables, all the distractions, all the behavioral issues that plagued under-resourced public schools, you could create a pure learning environment where teachers could just teach and students could just learn. To achieve this, no excuses schools implemented a set of famously rigid systems. Hallways were often silent, with students walking in single-file lines on designated tape marks. Classrooms used acronyms like SLANT, sit up, listen, ask and answer questions, nod your head and track the speaker, to codify the act of paying attention. A student's eyes were expected to follow the teacher at all times. Demerits were given for the smallest of infractions. An untucked shirt, a pencil that wasn't sharpened, a sigh and eye roll. And merits were given for perfect compliance. The school day was often longer, the school year extended, and homework was mandatory and voluminous. It was, in essence, an attempt to build a total institution, a place where the outside world and its chaotic influences could be held at bay. And for many parents, desperate for an alternative to failing and often violent neighborhood schools, this was a godsend. It was safe. It was orderly. Their children were finally learning. The test scores, as we saw, seemed to prove it worked. But as these schools multiplied, a different set of data points began to emerge, painting a much more troubling picture. The first cracks in the miracle narrative came from suspension rates. While no excuses charter schools were posting incredible academic gains, many were also suspending students at rates that were double, triple, or in some cases, more than 10 times that of the public school districts they operated in. Students were being sent home for days at a time for infractions that would barely warrant a talking to in another school. Uniform violations, talking back, or accumulating too many demerits for minor misbehaviors. Critics began to ask a pointed question. Were these schools truly teaching all students, or were they simply filtering out the ones who wouldn't or couldn't comply? This gave rise to the explosive accusation of push-out. The theory was that the relentless system of demerits, detentions, and suspensions wasn't just about maintaining order. It was a mechanism to systematically counsel out, or push out, the most challenging students. A student with undiagnosed ADHD, a child dealing with trauma at home, or simply a teenager with a rebellious streak would find it nearly impossible to survive in such a system. After being suspended again and again, falling further behind in their work, and feeling constantly criticized, many would eventually give up and leave. When these students left, they would quietly re-enroll in the local traditional public school, which by law had to accept them. The charter school's test scores would then remain high, unburdened by the students who struggled the most. This wasn't just a theory. Researchers began to look at attrition rates, the percentage of students who left a school between the start of middle or high school and graduation. In some of the most celebrated charter networks, these rates were astonishingly high. They were enrolling a large class of 5th graders, but by the time that class reached 8th grade, a significant portion, sometimes a third or even half of the original students were gone. This created a vicious feedback loop. The charter school looked like a miracle, succeeding with a cohort of students who were, on average, more compliant and easier to teach. Meanwhile, the neighborhood public school became a concentrated repository for the students the charter school had pushed out, in addition to its existing population. Its test scores would languish or fall, making the charter school look even more successful by comparison. The very system designed to prove that demography wasn't destiny was now being accused of gaming the demographic data to its own advantage. Beyond the data, a human story was unfolding. Former students and teachers began to speak out about the immense psychological pressure of the no excuses environment. They described a culture of fear, where one wrong move could lead to public shaming or punishment. They talked about the exhaustion of having to be on and perfectly compliant for 8 to 10 hours a day. The focus on control, they argued, came at the expense of critical thinking, creativity, and joy. It taught students how to follow rules, but did it teach them how to think for themselves? Did it prepare them for the nuance and ambiguity of college and adult life, where there are no tape marks on the floor and no demerit slips for disagreeing with your boss? One former teacher described it as feeling like she was training well-behaved robots, not educating young minds. The goal became compliance above all else, not curiosity, not passion, not intellectual discovery. And the burden of this compliance fell disproportionately on Black and brown students, the very students the movement was meant to empower. Critics argued that the no excuses model, with its emphasis on silence, order, and unwavering obedience to authority, was conditioning children of color for a life of subservience, not leadership. It was teaching them that their voices didn't matter, that their culture was something to be suppressed, and that their primary value was in their ability to conform. This critique hit the charter movement like a tidal wave. The very schools that had been held up as beacons of hope by presidents and philanthropists were now being framed as culturally insensitive, emotionally damaging, and fundamentally inequitable. The debate was no longer just about test scores. It was about the soul of education. What was the purpose of a school? Was it to produce high scores at any cost? Or was it to nurture a whole child, their intellect, their creativity, their emotional well-being, and their sense of self? To be clear, for every critic, there was a parent who would swear by the no excuses model. A parent who would say, "My child is finally safe. My child is finally learning to read. This structure is exactly what my child needed." The movement's defenders argued that the critics, often privileged outsiders, simply didn't understand the realities of generational poverty and urban violence. They argued that this level of structure was a necessary precondition for learning, a temporary scaffold that would allow students to build the academic and behavioral skills they would need to succeed later in life. Without this foundation, they argued, there would be no creativity, no higher-order thinking because the basics were never mastered. But even within the movement, a quiet revolution was beginning. The leaders of the most prominent no-excuses networks were not deaf to the criticism. They saw the data on suspensions. They heard the stories from former students. And they began to grapple with a difficult realization. Maybe they had gone too far. Maybe, in their zealous quest to prove what was possible, they had created something that was effective, but also brittle and, at times, inhumane. The architects of the miracle were starting to question their own blueprint. The conversation began to shift away from grit and rigor and towards words like joy, love, and social-emotional learning. The No Excuses movement was about to face an identity crisis, one that would force it to evolve or risk becoming a relic of a bygone era. The question was no longer if charters could raise test scores. The question was, what did it cost to do so, and was there a better way? That cost, it turned out, was not something you could easily measure on a spreadsheet. It was a human cost, paid in the currency of childhood anxiety, teacher burnout, and cultural friction. To understand it, you have to go inside the temples of this new reform movement. The No Excuses charter schools. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, they were the undisputed kings. Networks like KIPP, Achievement First, and Uncommon Schools were celebrated on magazine covers and hailed by politicians from both parties. Their formula seemed foolproof, a magic bullet for educational inequality. It was built on a few core pillars: more time in school with longer days and sometimes Saturday classes, a laser-like focus on basic reading and math skills, constant data collection and analysis to track student progress, and most famously, a culture of strict, unwavering discipline. The philosophy was simple: to close the achievement gap, you must first close the belief gap. You must hold students from low-income backgrounds to the highest possible standards, refusing to accept any excuse for failure, whether from the student, the parent, or the teacher. The environment was meticulously engineered for academic focus. Hallways were silent. Students walked in single-file lines, hands clasped behind their backs, or in a specific formation. Uniforms had to be perfect. A shirt untucked, a scuff on a shoe, an eye roll in class. These weren't minor infractions. They were cracks in the foundation of an orderly learning environment, and they were met with immediate consequences. Demerits, detention, public correction. The system was called SLANT. Sit up, listen, ask and answer questions, nod your head and track the speaker. It was a script for engagement, designed to eliminate distraction. And for a time the results seemed to speak for themselves. Test scores in these schools soared, dramatically outpacing their district counterparts. Students who had been years behind were suddenly catching up, getting into college and breaking cycles of poverty. These schools were seen as proof that demography was not destiny, that with the right structure and the right expectations, any child could succeed. The narrative was powerful, intoxicating even. It was a story of hope, of salvation through structure. But beneath the surface of those rising test scores, a different story was starting to be told. It was whispered at first by former students and burned-out teachers. They spoke of a silent toll. Students talked about the constant pressure, the feeling of walking on eggshells every single day, the fear of accumulating too many demerits, of being the one whose name was called out. They described a school day that felt less like an exploration of knowledge and more like a high-stakes performance, where the main goal was to avoid making a mistake. The joy of learning, the spontaneous curiosity that fuels a young mind, was often a casualty of the rigid, relentless drive for results. Creativity and critical thinking took a backseat to rote memorization and test-taking strategies. The silent curriculum was teaching compliance above all else. Then came the teachers. The no excuses model demanded a level of commitment that was almost superhuman. Arriving before dawn, staying late into the night grading papers and calling parents working weekends. The emotional labor was immense, a constant cycle of enforcing rules, motivating students, and hitting aggressive data targets. While many teachers were true believers who poured their hearts into the mission, the model was a crucible. The burnout rate was staggering. Many young, idealistic educators would last only 2 or 3 years before collapsing under the weight of the expectations, leaving a revolving door of staff that undermined the very stability the schools promised. But the most damaging critique, the one that struck at the very heart of the no excuses success story, was the accusation of push-out. Critics and researchers began to notice a troubling pattern. These schools, which accepted students via random lottery, often saw their student populations change over time. Students who struggled to adapt to the strict behavioral codes, especially students with disabilities or undiagnosed trauma, would accumulate demerits and detentions at an alarming rate. Their parents would be called in for meeting after meeting. Eventually, facing the prospect of suspension or even expulsion, many families would feel they had no choice but to withdraw their child and return to the local public school. This phenomenon, whether it was an intentional strategy or an unintentional byproduct of the model, had a profound effect on the data. If the most challenging students were systemically weeded out, were the sky-high test scores a result of a superior educational model, or simply a result of teaching a more compliant, easier-to-educate group of students? It was a devastating question that threatened to unravel the entire narrative. The schools fiercely denied these claims, arguing their attrition rates were comparable to district schools, and that they worked tirelessly to support every child. But the perception stuck, raising a fundamental ethical dilemma. Was it fair to build a model of success on the backs of the students it left behind? By the mid-2010s, this internal critique was joined by a powerful external one, focused on culture and identity. The vast majority of students in no excuses schools were black and brown, while the majority of their teachers and leaders were white. Critics began to argue that the model, for all its good intentions, was an exercise in assimilation. The focus on silence, order, and compliance, they argued, was not about creating a conducive learning environment, but about forcing children of color to conform to white, middle-class norms of behavior. It was about controlling bodies, not liberating minds. The curriculum often lacked cultural relevance, sidelining Black and Latino history and literature in favor of a traditional canon. The message, critics said, was that to be successful, you had to shed parts of your own culture and adopt another. This was the identity crisis the charter movement was facing. The model that had brought it so much success and acclaim was now being viewed as punitive, culturally tone-deaf, and perhaps even built on a statistical illusion. The movement had to evolve, and it did. The backlash against no excuses didn't destroy the charter school idea. It forced it to diversify. A new wave of charter school leaders, many of them educators of color who had started their careers inside the no excuses world, began to forge a different path. They asked a different set of questions. What if a school could have high expectations and be a place of joy? What if academic rigor could coexist with social-emotional learning? What if, instead of zero-tolerance discipline, schools used restorative justice practices that taught students to repair harm and build community? What if the curriculum celebrated, rather than erased, the cultural backgrounds of the students it served? From this questioning, a new breed of charter school began to emerge. Schools focused on project-based learning, where students solved real-world problems. Schools with a deep commitment to mental health, with social workers and counselors on staff. Schools that embraced culturally relevant pedagogy, ensuring that students saw themselves and their histories reflected in the books they read and the lessons they were taught. These schools rejected the idea that children from low-income communities needed a rigid, militaristic environment to succeed. They argued the opposite, that what these children needed was what affluent children had always had: the freedom to be curious, to make mistakes, to be creative, and to be seen and valued for who they are. This was not a minor disagreement. It was a fundamental schism, a battle for the very soul of the charter school movement. The old guard, the data-driven titans who had built an empire on structure and discipline, now found themselves on the defensive. They argued that their methods worked, that the test scores were undeniable proof, and that their critics were sacrificing student achievement at the altar of progressive ideology. On the other side, a new generation of innovators argued that true education was about more than a test score. It was about nurturing whole human beings, empowering them to think critically, and preparing them not just for college, but for a life of leadership and purpose. The civil war for the future of charter schools had begun. Within the charter movement, two armies born from the same revolution now stared across a philosophical battlefield. On one side stood the titans, the pragmatists, the data-driven warriors of the no excuses model. Their banners were emblazoned with test scores and college acceptance rates. Their philosophy was forged in the fire of urban educational failure, a direct, disciplined assault on the achievement gap. For them, the path out of poverty was paved with rigor, structure, and an unwavering belief that demography was not destiny. Walk into one of their schools in the late 2000s or early 2010s, and the atmosphere was electric, unmistakable. The hallways were silent. Students walked in single-file lines, hands clasped behind their backs or at their sides, their eyes locked forward. This was called tracking the speaker. In the classroom, the energy was focused, intense. A teacher would snap their fingers, and 100 pairs of eyes would snap to attention. They used acronyms like SLANT. Sit up, listen, ask questions, nod your head, and track the speaker. Every minute of the day was meticulously scheduled, from the moment a student arrived for a 7:30 a.m. start to the moment they left, often after hours of mandatory tutoring or homework help. The school day was longer. The school year was longer. The expectations were higher. This wasn't chaos. It was a highly engineered system designed to maximize academic learning time and minimize distractions. The core belief was that many students from disadvantaged backgrounds had been let down by a system that expected too little of them. The no excuses model flipped that script. It demanded excellence and refused to accept poverty, neighborhood violence, or a difficult home life as a justification for failure. The message was clear. Your circumstances do not define you. Your hard work will. And the results were impossible to ignore. Networks like KIPP, Achievement First, and Uncommon schools were posting staggering numbers. Their predominantly low-income minority students weren't just catching up to their wealthier suburban peers. In many cases, they were outperforming them on standardized tests. College acceptance rates soared. For the first time, it seemed someone had cracked the code. Here was a scalable, replicable model that took students from the nation's most underserved communities and put them on a reliable path to higher education. To politicians, philanthropists, and desperate parents, this looked like a miracle. It was the fulfillment of the original charter school promise. But on the other side of the battlefield, a different army was gathering. They were the humanists, the progressives, the advocates for the whole child. They looked at the silent hallways and the slant posters, and they saw something else. They saw compliance, not engagement. They saw order, but not joy. They worried that in the relentless pursuit of test scores, the system was squeezing out the very things that make learning magical: curiosity, creativity, and the freedom to make a glorious mess. Their critique was sharp and deeply felt. They argued that the no excuses model, with its strict disciplinary codes, often resulted in sky-high suspension rates for minor infractions, disproportionately affecting Black and brown boys. They pointed to the punishingly long hours and high-pressure environment that led to staggering rates of teacher burnout. More fundamentally, they asked a troubling question. What kind of citizens are we creating? Are we teaching students how to think, or are we teaching them how to follow directions? Are we preparing them for a life of intellectual inquiry, or are we just training them to be really, really good at taking tests? These weren't just fringe critics. They were educators and parents who envisioned a different kind of charter school. A school where, instead of memorizing formulas, students would work together for months to design and build a functional robot. A school where learning about the Civil War meant writing and performing a play, not just bubbling in answers on a multiple-choice exam. They championed models like project-based learning, arts integration, and social-emotional curricula. They believed that a student's well-being, their mental health, and their ability to collaborate were just as important as their reading level. Schools like High Tech High in San Diego became their standard-bearers, showcasing a vibrant, student-centered approach that produced stunningly sophisticated work and deeply engaged learners. This internal conflict didn't happen in a vacuum. It was amplified and supercharged by the politics of the era. The Obama administration, through its landmark Race to the Top initiative, poured billions of dollars into education reform. But that money came with strings attached. States were incentivized to lift caps on charter schools, but also to adopt rigorous accountability systems based heavily on, you guessed it, standardized test scores. Suddenly, the federal government was putting a massive thumb on the scale. The very policies designed to foster charter school innovation were now effectively favoring one specific, highly debated model. The no-excuses schools, with their laser focus on data and test results, were perfectly positioned to thrive in this new environment. They spoke the language of accountability that Washington wanted to hear. The whole-child schools, whose greatest successes were often harder to quantify. A student's newfound confidence, their passion for a subject, their ability to work in a team, found themselves at a disadvantage. Their data wasn't as clean, their results not as easily plotted on a graph. The civil war for the soul of the charter movement was now being fought on a national stage. It became a proxy war for the biggest questions in American education. What is the true purpose of school? Is it to prepare students for the workforce and close economic gaps? Or is it to cultivate thoughtful, creative, and engaged human beings? Can it be both? For parents, the choice became agonizing. Imagine you live in a neighborhood with a chronically failing traditional public school. You enter the charter school lottery, and you win 2 seats. School A is a no-excuses academy. It has a strict reputation, but its graduates go to top universities. It is a proven, if demanding, ticket to a better life. School B is a whole-child charter. It's known for its joyful atmosphere and creative projects. The kids seem happy, but its test scores are just average. It's a less certain path. Which do you choose for your child? The guaranteed opportunity that might crush their spirit, or the joyful environment with a less certain academic outcome? There was no easy answer. This tension ripped through the teaching profession as well. Young, idealistic teachers fresh out of college and eager to make a difference flocked to no-excuses schools, drawn by the mission and the promise of dramatic results. But many found themselves burning out within a few years, exhausted by the 80-hour work weeks and the emotional toll of being a constant disciplinarian. A quiet exodus began as veteran teachers left the high-pressure models, seeking out schools that gave them more autonomy and allowed them to build deeper, more holistic relationships with their students. By the mid-2010s, the no-excuses model was the undisputed king of the charter world. It dominated the headlines, attracted the lion's share of philanthropic funding, and was hailed by reformers from both political parties as the solution to educational inequality. It was an empire built on discipline, data, and dramatic results. But empires are fragile things, and the whispers of dissent that started on the other side of the battlefield were growing louder. The critiques were no longer just philosophical. Journalists, researchers, and filmmakers began to dig deeper, and the stories they uncovered started to paint a more complicated, and at times a more disturbing picture. The king, it turned out, was not invincible, and the Civil War was about to enter a brutal new phase, where the movement would be forced to confront the unintended consequences of its own success. The first cracks in the armor appeared not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a spreadsheet. The original charter vision, born from the minds of educators, was about innovation and autonomy. It was about freeing teachers to teach. But as the movement grew, as it became a national phenomenon with billions of public dollars attached, a different kind of innovator showed up. The entrepreneur. The investor. Theo. Suddenly, the language of education began to change. It wasn't just about pedagogy and student growth anymore. It was about market share, scalability, and return on investment. This was the dawn of the Charter Management Organization, or CMO. At first, they seemed like a logical next step. Nonprofits like KIPP and Achievement First had already proven that a successful school model could be replicated. But what followed was a new breed, the for-profit CMO. Companies began to see public education not as a civic duty, but as a vast, untapped market. Wall Street money began to flow in. Venture capitalists who once funded tech startups were now funding school networks. And with that money came a fundamental, seismic shift in the movement's DNA. The question was no longer just, how can we best educate children? It was now tangled up with, how can we do it profitably? This new gold rush created a perverse set of incentives. Stories began to surface that were impossible to ignore. In states like Ohio and Florida, online charter schools run by for-profit giants were receiving hundreds of millions in public funds, while posting abysmal graduation rates and rock-bottom test scores. They mastered the art of student recruitment, but not the art of education. These were schools that existed primarily on servers, with massive student-to-teacher ratios and a curriculum that often amounted to little more than glorified digital worksheets. Yet, they were collecting per-pupil funding as if they were brick-and-mortar institutions with libraries, labs, and human counselors. The scandals weren't just virtual. Across the country, headlines started to paint a picture of grift and mismanagement. Founders of charter schools were caught using public money to buy luxury cars and personal real estate. Complicated leasing agreements were set up where a charter operator would use taxpayer dollars to rent a building from a private company that they themselves owned, charging exorbitant rates and pocketing the difference. These weren't isolated incidents. It was a pattern emerging in dozens of cities. Communities that had been promised a life raft were instead watching their tax dollars get siphoned away, sometimes leaving behind nothing but an empty building and a cohort of displaced students. These were the ghost schools, monuments to broken promises. For families, the consequences were devastating. Imagine sending your child to a school you believe in, a school that promised a better future, only to show up one Monday morning and find the doors chained shut, with a note saying it has permanently closed due to financial insolvency. Your child's records are gone, their teachers are gone, and you are left scrambling to find a new school mid-year, thrown back into the very system you were trying to escape. This happened to thousands of families, a brutal bait-and-switch that eroded public trust and armed charter opponents with their most potent weapon. Evidence of systemic failure and outright fraud. But an even more profound, more troubling critique was taking hold, one that cut to the very core of the movement's moral claim. The charge was that charter schools, despite their rhetoric of serving the underserved, were actually accelerating the resegregation of American education. Researchers at UCLA's Civil Rights Project began publishing studies showing that charter schools were, on average, more racially and economically isolated than their public school counterparts. The data suggested a two-tiered system was emerging. Charters, critics argued, were cream skimming, subtly recruiting or retaining higher-achieving students and counseling out those with significant behavioral or learning disabilities, who were more expensive and difficult to educate. The mechanisms were subtle but effective. A charter might not have a special education program robust enough for a child with severe needs. It might have a disciplinary code so strict that it disproportionately pushed out black and brown boys. It might require mandatory parent volunteer hours, or a lengthy application process that served as a barrier for the most disadvantaged families. Whether intentional or not, the result was the same: the creation of educational islands that, while perhaps successful on paper, left the surrounding public schools with an even higher concentration of the most vulnerable, most expensive to educate students. The promise was to lift all boats. The reality, some argued, was a fleet of shiny new lifeboats leaving the old ship to sink. This critique landed like a bombshell because it reframed the entire debate. Was this a civil rights movement as advocates claimed? Or was it a market-based reform that prioritized choice for some at the expense of the system as a whole? Simultaneously, the very philosophy that had made charters famous was being put on trial. The no excuses model, pioneered by networks like KIPP, was built on a foundation of strict discipline, high expectations, and relentless focus. Students walked in silent, single-file lines. They used hand signals to ask for permission to speak. Their days were longer. Their school year extended. Demerits were given for the smallest infractions: an untucked shirt, a slouching posture, a lost pencil. For years, this was lauded as the magic formula, the tough love antidote to the chaos of underperforming urban schools. The results, measured by test scores, seemed to speak for themselves. But a growing chorus of educators, parents, and even alumni began to push back. They argued that no excuses was not a culture of achievement, but a culture of compliance. They said it prioritized control over critical thinking, and that its rigid, punitive nature was particularly damaging to students of color, teaching them to conform and obey, rather than to question and create. Stories emerged of children suffering from extreme anxiety, of creativity being stifled, of a school environment that felt less like a place of learning, and more like a place of surveillance. The model that had been hailed as the solution was now being condemned as culturally insensitive and psychologically harmful. The movement's signature success was becoming its most polarizing controversy. Faced with this multi-front assault, charges of profiteering, segregation, and punitive methods, the charter school movement, for the first time, found itself on the defensive. The narrative had flipped. The plucky Davids fighting the bureaucratic Goliath now looked, to many, like a Goliath in their own right, a corporate, unregulated, and unaccountable force steamrolling communities. The teachers' unions, which had been reeling for years, saw their opening. They regrouped and launched a powerful, coordinated counteroffensive. They funded political campaigns, organized parent groups, and hammered the message of privatization and profit. The fight moved from school districts to state capitals. Battles erupted over charter funding, over caps on the number of new schools, and over the basic question of who should be allowed to authorize and oversee them. It was no longer a debate on the fringes of education policy. It was a central defining political war of the 21st century. The simple story was over. The movement was now mired in the messy, contradictory, and often ugly reality of its own creation. It had won the right to exist, but in doing so, it had unleashed forces it could no longer control and started a war that threatened to consume everyone involved. And so the battle lines were drawn. This wasn't a war fought with armies, but with statistics and school budgets, with lawn signs and school board elections. It was a war of narratives, waged in the media and in the living rooms of anxious parents. On one side, the defenders of traditional public education, led by teachers' unions and community activists, who saw charters as a Trojan horse for privatization, a scheme to drain precious resources from neighborhood schools and hand them over to unaccountable, privately run organizations. They painted a picture of a zero-sum game, where every student who left for a charter took with them thousands of dollars in public funding, leaving the local public school to educate the most challenging, most expensive students with less and less money. They pointed to the scandals, the self-dealing, the outright fraud, the charter schools that closed overnight, leaving families stranded. For them, this was a fight to save a sacred American institution. On the other side stood the reformers, a powerful coalition of venture philanthropists, conservative think tanks, and a new generation of education entrepreneurs. They saw themselves as liberators, breaking the iron grip of a failed bureaucracy and a calcified union monopoly. They argued that money should follow the child, not prop up a failing system. They championed choice as a fundamental civil right, especially for low-income families of color trapped in chronically underperforming schools. They held up their star performers, the KIPS, the Success Academies, the Uncommon Schools, as proof of concept. These were schools that took the same kids from the same neighborhoods and produced dramatically different results. Their mantra was simple and devastatingly effective. Poverty is not destiny. No more excuses. Caught in the crossfire were the parents and the children. For a parent watching their child languish in a school they felt was unsafe or uninspiring, the ideological debate was meaningless. A charter school wasn't a political statement. It was a lifeline. It was the promise of a different future, a lottery ticket to the American dream. Their choice wasn't about privatization. It was about survival. So after 3 decades of this conflict, what is the verdict? Has the charter school experiment born from that simple idea of a teacher-led laboratory actually worked? The honest answer is profoundly unsatisfying. It depends entirely on who you ask and which data you choose to believe. If you look at the most celebrated charter networks, the evidence for success seems undeniable. Rigorous, gold standard studies from researchers at Stanford, MIT, and Harvard have used lottery data to compare students who got into these high-performing charters with those who applied but didn't get a spot. The results are often stunning. Students in these schools, overwhelmingly poor and minority, show massive learning gains, particularly in math. They are more likely to score higher on standardized tests, more likely to take advanced coursework, and more likely to enroll in a 4-year college. For hundreds of thousands of students, these schools have been, by any reasonable measure, life-changing. They are the shining examples held up by proponents as proof that the model works. But if you zoom out from these elite networks and look at the national picture, the story becomes far murkier. The most comprehensive national studies, conducted by Stanford Center for Research on Education Outcomes, or CREDO, have consistently found that, on average, charter school students perform about the same as their peers in traditional public schools. Some charters are dramatically better, some are dramatically worse, and a great many are statistically indistinguishable. The revolution, it seems, has produced an outcome that looks a lot like the old system. A handful of excellent schools, a handful of terrible ones, and a vast mediocre middle. And then there are the darker questions that haunt the movement. Critics have long accused charters of creaming and cropping, skimming the most motivated students and families from the district pool, and then pushing out the most difficult-to-teach students once they're enrolled. While many charters do incredible work with challenging populations, the data shows that, on the whole, charter schools enroll fewer students with severe disabilities and fewer English language learners than their neighborhood public school counterparts. And stories abound of students being counseled out or facing harsh disciplinary policies that lead them to voluntarily withdraw, conveniently just before state testing days. This practice of attrition polishes the school's test scores, But it sends the most vulnerable children back to the very public schools that are now being judged as failures in comparison. The original vision of Albert Shanker was for charters to be incubators, engines of innovation that would discover new teaching methods and then share them back with the traditional system, lifting all boats. That almost never happened. Instead of collaboration, the system fostered competition. Charters and traditional public schools became rivals, fighting over a finite pool of students and dollars. Rather than a laboratory integrated with the system, charters became a parallel system operating outside of it. This financial strain is not theoretical. In cities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Oakland, school districts now spend hundreds of millions, sometimes over $1 billion a year in funds that are passed through to charter schools. This loss of enrollment and revenue has forced traditional districts to close neighborhood schools, lay off teachers, and cut programs like art, music, and sports, creating a vicious cycle. As the district schools' offerings shrink, it becomes less attractive, pushing more families to seek out charter options, which in turn drains more resources. It's a death spiral that many urban districts are now struggling to escape. And so, we are left with a legacy of profound contradiction. The charter movement succeeded in shattering the one-size-fits-all model of American public education. It injected a sense of urgency and proved that demographics do not have to be destiny. It empowered parents with choice and created pockets of excellence in places where hope had long since vanished. It forced the entire education establishment to confront its own failures in a way it never had before. But it did so at a tremendous cost. It fostered a market-based, competitive environment that has often undermined the collaborative, public good mission of schooling. It created a two-tiered system that, in many communities, has exacerbated segregation by race and class. And it opened the door to private management and for-profit interests in a way that has blurred the very definition of what it means to be a public school. Is a school funded by taxpayers but run by a private board, with no elected oversight, truly public? The charter movement has forced us to ask that question, but has provided no easy answer. The story of charter schools is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It's a story about a nation grappling with its most deeply held beliefs and its most painful failures. It reflects our endless search for a silver bullet to solve the intractable problem of educational inequality. It's a mirror held up to our society's constant battle between the ideals of individual liberty and collective responsibility, between the allure of market-based solutions and the promise of democratic institutions. The rise of charter schools was never just about education. It was about defining the future of the American experiment itself. In the end, the movement didn't provide a final answer. Instead, it left us with a more fundamental and difficult question, one we are still struggling with today. What do we owe each other? And what is the promise of public education we want to keep for all of our children, not just the lucky few who win the lottery?